Hi, I'm Dr. Thomas Armstrong, and I'm making a series of short videos to introduce my new book, The Power of Neurodiversity, Unleashing the Advantages of Your Neurodivergent Brain. This is a completely revised and updated second edition of a book that I originally wrote in 2010. The topic of this video is a history of ADHD. Before we called it ADHD, we had many different kinds of terms, everything from hyperkinetic disease of infancy to hyperactive child syndrome to minimal brain damage. But it was in the 1960s that a major shift occurred in psychology. Up to that point, behaviorism had been the ruling paradigm, and hyperactivity was a behavioral description. In other words, the child is acting hyperactive. But what happened in the 60s was that cognitive paradigms took over from behaviorist paradigms, and people began to think about the inner workings of the mind, studying things like problem solving and perception and attention. And in 1971, Virginia Douglas, a Canadian psychologist, suggested to an audience of the Canadian Association of Psychology that attention be the focus rather than hyperactivity. Up to that point, hyperactivity was the main diagnosis, and attention was just seen as a tiny part of that. And she suggested switching that and making attention the focus. And what this helped do was turn the focus of psychological research laboratories on the study of attention. And over the course of the 70s, the process of researching attention and attention deficits began to take place quietly under this behind the scenes, so to speak. So ADHD was not really on many people's lips at that point. But the 1970s saw another important switch, and that was, and this also started maybe a little bit earlier in the 60s, is that psychiatry switched its focus from a Freudian perspective to a psychobiological perspective. Up till that point, if you went to see a psychiatrist and you related your problems, they would talk about, an Oedipal crisis, an Oedipal complex, conflicts with your father, you want to sleep with your mother, sibling conflict, things like that. And after that time, when that shift occurred, it could have begun as early as the late 50s. But by the 70s, psychobiological thinking was predominant in psychiatry, and the focus was not on tell me your dreams. The focus was on let's look at what medications would be helpful to treat your condition. In the 1980s, ADHD, which was being, as I mentioned, silently being researched in psychology laboratories in universities around the country and the world, began to come out of the closet, so to speak, and attain some public recognition. And the reason for that, I think a big part of it is parent advocacy groups got involved. And as a result of that, they brought it into the mainstream. The group CHAD, Children and Adults with Attention Deficit Disorder, was founded in 1981, and ADHD became a topic, or ADD as it was called back then, became a topic on talk shows. You began seeing it discussed on Phil Donahue and Oprah Winfrey, and even on shows like Wayne's World, a movie like Wayne's World. You had the Mike Myers character Wayne periodically telling Garth to take his Ritalin. And that was, again, fairly new, to bring it out into the mainstream. In the 1990s, ADHD continued to grow in public understanding and knowledge. And an interesting thing happened. ADHD qualified as a disorder in the schools. Now, I said that parent advocacy groups were lobbying Congress in the 1980s and into the 1990s for ADHD to be a qualifying handicapping term under special education laws. And the interesting point that's often lost in looking back is that Congress refused to make it an official disorder qualifying for federal funding. But the U.S. Department of Education quietly circulated a letter to superintendents in charge of state schools in 1991 showing that there were a variety of ways in which existing laws could be used to qualify kids for ADHD. For example, under the other health impaired idea or the rehabilitation law, there are 2 or 3 other ways in which ADHD could be qualified. And what this did was open the doors to ADHD programs in schools and ADHD tests to qualify for special education and ADHD teachers. It really made ADHD a big growth industry in education. In the 2000s, I think the drug companies began to work closely with MDs. Again, this probably started to happen earlier, but and it was interesting, since the year 2000, the Food and Drug Administration has cited all ADHD drugs for false and misleading advertising. That's another thing that's often not picked up. But drug companies would invite physicians to workshops where they would be taught about ADHD and the benefits of their particular medication and how they could get involved. The drug representative often called on physicians. So there was clearly a lot of cooperation between the drug industry and the American Medical Association. And you can read about that in a book by Alan Schwartz called ADHD Nation. He chronicles many of these contacts between drug companies and physicians. In the 2010s, ADHD diagnoses skyrocketed. And for example, compared to 1999, the 2010 diagnoses were 5 times what they were in 1999. And of course, you can say we got better at identifying it, and certainly that's probably true. But there are also all these other social forces, including increasing public recognition, involvement of drug companies, working closely with MDs, the involvement of ADHD in the schools, all help to bring ADHD into common understanding as a major disorder. And by the 2020s, ADHD was diagnosed and is diagnosed in over 10% of kids, 62% of which are taking ADHD drugs. Now, I've had a lot to say about ADHD in the past, and I've written books with titles like The Myth of the ADHD Child. I certainly believe that ADHD exists. The symptoms are real, but I've been interested in these other social influences that have occurred that suggest why it has grown so widely and how it may be overdiagnosed currently in our country and around the world. So I feel my current thinking on this is that ADHD is a form of neurodiversity. It's the fact that not that these kids or adults have defective brains, they have different brains. They're wired differently. And in future videos, I'm going to talk about some of the different ways in which the ADHD brain is wired, so we can have a better understanding so that we aren't totally engulfed by all of the deficit-oriented terminology of the medical paradigm. So that's a little bit about the history of ADHD. I talk about it more in my book, The Power of Neurodiversity. I hope you get the book and share it with your friends, with your doctor, with your teachers, and with others who might benefit from it. If you want to sign up for my blog posts, go to my website, which is www.institute4learning.com. That's institute4learning.com. And either on my web page or on my blog page, enter your email to subscribe, and you'll receive my 200-item neurodiversity strengths checklist, which is a strength-based assessment that I've created because there were so many assessments out there for neurodivergent people that focused on what they couldn't do rather than what they could do. And I thought, if somebody's having trouble, what they need to be surrounded by are people who see the best in them, and they need to see the best in themselves. And this checklist was designed for that purpose and is taken from my book. Anyway, thank you very much for listening and for watching. I appreciate your time spent on this video, and I wish you all the best in celebrating neurodiversity and helping every person, whether neurodivergent or neurotypical, achieve their full potential in life. Thanks so much. Bye.